All right, welcome to week number 6. This week we're going to talk about police report writing and what that looks like. So the agenda for this week cover police report writing, how to write a report, what to include, what the overall approval process looks like, and how to complete a criminal case, putting together a case file, and then also just what the criminal justice process looks like as a whole. So let's first consider, why do police write reports at all, especially given today's age where the majority of the police contact is likely recorded on a body-worn camera or by a dash camera from the police officer's car. Why can't we just do a video recording and submit that and say, see attached video? Well, there's a number of reasons why that is not allowed or a common practice. First and foremost, there's admissibility into court proceedings where, excuse me, the court's not going to want to review hours upon hours of police contact. They want to be able to refer to a police report that succinct summarizes the factual evidence that occurred, and they can quickly extrapolate that information out and make decisions for charging what happened. Also, police write reports so that when they're testifying in court, they can refer to the report to refresh their memory, provide things in chronological order in a sequence of events that makes sense, and then also to record specific statements or quotes, pieces of evidence that are pertinent to the case. And the details and specifics for specific criminal charges are really what the report is meant to support. So when we talk about police reports, and we'll kind of briefly go into how to write a police report, but they should be very easy for the audience to pick up a police report and to read the entirety of the report and for it to make just logical sense. So the reports should use just common language, not using police jargon or acronyms, anything like that. Any lay person should be able to grab a police report and easily read along and understand with great detail what happened. The report should describe what the officer was able to observe and not draw conclusions. It shouldn't lead the reader to a series of conclusions or inferences. Instead, it should just list the facts, and those facts should provide the reader to come to recommendations for potential criminal charges. It also should explain what the police officer's actions or reactions or thought process was during the contact. It should describe the witnesses, any available evidence in interactions with either the subject or witnesses. Anybody associated with the scene should be described in the report so that the reader understands who was all there, what their role in the incident was. So let's take a few minutes here to talk about an observation versus an inference. So there's a very important distinction, and when you are talking about police reports, one that the writer, as they're writing it, must make sure that they're really staying in the observation realm and not putting in inferences. So an inference is something that can be taking an observation and then reading too much into it and drawing a conclusion. The challenge there is that often our inferences may not be correct or based off of facts, or they might also be drawn from bias or from heuristics that are in some way maybe not matching the evidence. So observations, though, are merely what was seen or observed. They're usually facts-based and supported by evidence. So as an example, we'll look at this picture here. If we were going to list observations, we would start with, we see a young little girl. She's wearing pink pants. You'd describe her shoes. Kind of hard to tell in the picture, but maybe they're blue or gray. Look like maybe Velcro closing shoes, and she's holding a spoon in her left hand, and she's wearing pigtails. And she seems to be crying. She has her mouth open and is visibly upset. We can also observe that there appears to be an ice cream cone on the ground, and that maybe the ice cream is spilling onto the ground. So those would be factual observations that anybody can look at the picture. We could also go so far as to describe, the condition of her pants. It looks like ice cream or some substance is spilled onto her pants, and they look kind of wet. And there's a substance also on the bench. So observations, all articulable facts that we can see with our eyes, if it was beyond just observations and we could hear things, we would also list those as observations. Inferences would be different. An inference might be that we look at this picture and we say the little girl is crying because she dropped her ice cream cone and it's on the ground. So that's an inference. But what if we then learned that no, instead the little girl asked for a teddy bear and the parents said no, and then she threw the ice cream cone down on the ground? So, given context and additional information, our initial inference would be incorrect. So, that's where the difference between an observation and inference is extremely critical. And even more so when you are in the criminal justice realm, where someone's freedom and ability to go about their lives kind of lies in the balance. So police officers have to get this correct, and the difference between inferences and facts and observations is one that must be really clear. So in police reports, when they're written, the police officer wants to not use police jargon, and instead they want to be very descriptive in the types of language that they use. So commonly used in police jargon or in police reports is the phrase furtive movement. And within police circles, if one police officer was describing a story to another police officer, that might be acceptable. We're like, oh yeah, the suspect had furtive movement, so and then I had to draw my gun. Like the police officer knows then what is being described. But for the general audience, furtive movement could mean any number of things. So instead of using that generic jargon, it's much better to be descriptive in describing exactly what the movement was. So an example would be the suspect lunged to grab a pistol from the passenger floor area. Even better would be, describing what else was in the passenger area of the vehicle. Were the suspect's hands open? Were there statements being made as the suspect did that? Was it daytime or nighttime? How were you able to see what was in the area that the person was lunging to? What was the conversation leading up to that? That kind of stuff. Being descriptive really helps to set the scene and paint the picture for the reader. Another commonly used jargon is assaultive behavior. Well, that doesn't really tell the reader what is happening, what are the suspect's actions. Instead, being more descriptive would be the better way to go, where you could list pulled my hand away from my body as I attempted to draw my pistol. So that phrase, that description, adds more information beyond just assaultive behavior. To go even further would be to describe how the hand was pulled away from the officer's body. Was the suspect grabbing fingers and pulling? Is there any kind of martial arts tactics or techniques that were used? Any signs of training? Again, statements. Those kinds of things are helpful to add more information. Commonly seen in police reports is the phrase resisted arrest, but the more important thing that needs to be in there is the description of how did the suspect resist arrest. So another example, fought to overcome my efforts to put her arms behind her back. She had stiff flexed muscles, yelled, "You will never arrest me." So being descriptive in defining what is meant by those slogans or jargons is really what's critical. And as you'll see in the module when you watch some of the videos, when police officers write reports, they write it usually the same day or maybe the next shift at the latest. But the reason why they're writing it is the court process, it might be, it'll be several months, if not years later, when the police officer finally goes to trial and is testifying to what they witnessed and what they observed and what happened. And it's very similar to if I asked any one of you, what did you do last weekend? You might, if you think about it for a while, be able to tell me, some of the highlights of what you did. But generally speaking, what you'll recall would be something that was maybe outside of the usual for your weekend. Because the way that all of our memories work is we generally recall, the things that are outside of the norm that don't happen frequently. They might pop in your mind and be like, oh yeah, that's what I did this last weekend. But if you do the same thing every weekend, it might be more difficult to recall any of the subtle nuances from one weekend to the next. So much more difficult if I asked, what did you do 14 weekends ago? Or we get even more specific, what did you eat on Saturday 3 months ago? And you eat presumably every day, like most people. So, how would you ever be able to remember specifically what you ate on that one day or how you went about eating that meal? So, it's the same type of concept then for police officers because police officers, presumably, if they're working every day, they're probably making arrests and contacts with criminals or violators every day. And typically for the same types of crimes, and they're generally done in the same types of ways. So the police report and getting very descriptive and specific within the report is what's going to help the police officer to be able to recall, what that specific scenario and arrest looked like. So as you look to this photo here, describing, if we were talking about the gentleman in the gray shirt, describing some of the arm tattoos, the facial straining as these motions are going on, that might help bring a lot more detail and help with memory recall, months or years later. So again, when we're considering police reports and what in the world do you try to include in the police report, generally speaking, we're going to start with what the officer's legal authority was, which means the context for why they were at this location to begin with. Was this in response to a 911 call? Were they driving, doing routine patrol, and they observed some sort of a traffic violation? Was this a citizen that came up to them and initiated the contact? Whatever the legal authority was, that's important to put into the police report so that the reader and the court understand what legal grounds the officer was acting upon. Also, what was known by the officer at the time. A lot of police thought processes, especially when we get into use of force, depend on what's the police officer's intent and thought process and what was known in the moment. What facts are known and what facts are available to the officer about the incident. What evidence supports the investigation of the crime? That comes from a lot of statements made by witnesses or the suspect themselves through the course of the investigation. Again, back to descriptions of the scene, what is presented to the officer, what smells, odors, sounds, any of those things that the officer could detect or observe are helpful to understand the greater context of the scenario. And context as to, why was the police officer there, what, if any, crimes were being investigated, and how did any of that information come to the officer is important to all note. When we're talking about police reports, it's important in including all those details to also not forget about the basics. And when I'm talking about basic police reporting, that's also basic police investigations. So the time, the date, who the officers are at the scene. Generally speaking, there's more than one officer, especially if it's a critical incident or a major crime. It's important to know all of the officers that were present, because all of the officers are going to have a different and unique perspective, and they also will play a different role in the investigation of the scene. And so for the prosecutor and for the defense attorney to all get those reports and get those unique perspectives, that's an important piece to get. When the officer is writing the report, it is also important to know what kind of training, background, and experience they have, because what one officer has experience and training in may not be the same as another officer. I'll give you an example. If you are a detective that has worked a lot of narcotic, drug cases, they might see a lot of like precursor, seemingly not suspicious chemicals in somebody's closet, and recognize them to not just be cleaning chemicals, but those could all be precursors to manufacturing of a controlled substance. But if you as an officer don't have that training experience or background, you may not be able to draw the same kinds of conclusions as to the significance of those specific chemicals or the presence of certain things. Conversely, if you have a lot of experience in missing and exploiting children's investigations, doing forensic child interviews, if you're doing a domestic violence investigation and it involves a child in the household, some of the positioning statements or just general behaviors of a child might mean a lot more if you have a great deal of experience with child investigations as opposed to an officer who doesn't. So specific and advanced training, background experience can be very meaningful in including that in your report, because someone with a lot of experience, background, and training will likely be able to draw more significance from pieces of evidence that might be overlooked by maybe more of a junior officer. And then obviously spelling and grammar, it's important because it can also go towards the credibility of the officer and the credibility of the overall investigation. It needs to be complete and thorough, but also error-free. So as we continue to look at the investigative process, things that need to be included in the report are basic investigative process information. So how was the crime scene processed? What does the protocol and processes look like for that agency? Did the officer follow the agency guidelines in processing this scene? What was considered? What was known again by the officer or the detective, and what was being considered in the investigative process? What actions did you take, and an explanation as to why was this action taken and not this other action. So articulation of why the investigation progressed a certain way can help explain why that was the appropriate decision and what else was considered and why that wasn't appropriate. Exculpatory evidence is, as we discussed in the previous module, any evidence that would be more beneficial to the defendant. So was there evidence that's presented at the scene that would help refute or rebut a potential suspect? And what did you consider to be exculpatory or not? Witnesses, what witnesses exist? Also, what were the efforts to try to find and identify witnesses? That can be extremely meaningful to put into your report. Canvassing efforts, the same thing. How far did you extend your search to try to find, Ring video camera systems or surveillance video, or neighbors who might have heard something but maybe didn't see something? Documenting all of the efforts done to try to knock on neighbors' doors. Even if there was no answer, did the officer put in the report that house was checked or rechecked? And then putting in notes about the general cooperation with the investigation. That could be at the witnesses level, the suspect, other officers, other agencies. A lot of domestic violence cases will have other government agencies like Department of Health and Services, with when children are involved. The level of cooperation and integration with other departments is also very helpful to note into a report. So we talked about this a couple of modules ago, but understanding the elements of the crime and knowing what crime is being investigated, that is essential for all crimes. But when you're writing a report, it is a really good practice to have the RCW open and looking at what are the elements of that crime and making sure that you have satisfied or proven those elements of the crime, and that each one of those elements is articulated in the police report, and that there's evidence to support each one of those elements, or multiple pieces of evidence to support that. So knowing what is required by statute, and did you prove and meet those elements? Was the case completed to exhaustion? Did all of the leads end up getting followed up on? Is there any pending tasks related for the case? That could be any kind of toxicology reports or expert witness reports that might be still outstanding. You'd have to check with the prosecutor to see if they feel comfortable filing on a case, knowing if there's lab requests that could take more than a year to get those reports back. So just understanding those elements of the crime and what is already completed in the case and anything that might be still pending. So once all of the elements of the crime and things have been completed and they've been satisfied, you have a suspect identified, maybe they've already been placed into custody, and the prosecutor's office is satisfied with the status of the case and the reports, then the officer can request those charges, and the case is then considered to be completed. So then it's just easy, right? No, not so much. Once the investigation is complete, the case overall is probably still not completed. The collection of a lot of additional supplemental reports still has to be done. That could be things like autopsy reports, medical records. There could still be some canvas witness video or photo or social media video that could still exist. Any and all police reports, that would be your other officers that responded to the scene that helped out. Witness statements, generating a witness list for everybody who was there and either heard something or saw something, the evidence lists, and then forensic analysis. This is just not an exhaustive list by any means, but just an example of all of the types of reports and documents that would need to be included into a final completed case. All right, so as we look at how a case progresses through the criminal justice process, it's kind of an important thing to understand from the police perspective. So we'll start at the investigation process. It's finally completed. It gets sent over to the prosecutor's office. And one common misconception is that the police have the authority or ability to charge anybody criminally. That authority and responsibility actually sets with the prosecutor's office. So they actually will review the case, make a charging decision, and then from that charging decision, if they're going to move forward with criminal charges, then that subject will move forward to an arraignment or an initial hearing, at which time they'll bring forward the probable cause statements, what preliminary information and evidence they have on the case, which then moves over to discovery, where both the prosecutor and the defense attorney, both sides will have the ability to see any and all evidence that exists in the case. And from there, they move into the plea bargaining phase, where they can try to negotiate maybe a lower type of a crime or sentence based upon what evidence exists. That gets you to the preliminary hearing, where, again, depending on the type of case that it is and what evidence exists, from the preliminary hearing, you might move into pretrial motions, like motions to suppress different types of evidence. And then once those are all resolved, you can move into a trial. After the trial is completed, you have post-trial motions, then sentencing, and then if there's any subsequently appeal, that would happen at that time. So as you can see, there's lots of steps to the process, but really for the law enforcement officer, once the investigation is completed, it's kind of out of their hands. The majority of those steps through the criminal justice process then are with the prosecutor's office and the attorneys until the trial. Really, at the trial phase, the officer, detective is active again. Their role would be as a witness, how they conducted the investigation, collected the evidence, had interactions with the suspect or the witness. Those are the types of things that they'll present at trial. So when you hear a case file or a completed file, all kind of referring to the same thing. So once the investigation is completed, all of the documents, photos, video, everything related to that case is consolidated into one file, and that has to be preserved for a retention period, and that's set by the state archives. Sets the retention period for criminal cases, and it's based off of when the case is adjudicated and what type of case it is. But all that information is then preserved, but it has to be available to the defense and to the prosecutor. And so that's why it's important that there's no secret files or notes or any information not included in the case file. It all has to be preserved there. The only caveat there would be confidential informant would be protected, depending if the informant was signed as a confidential source. And then there are some nuanced protections that CIs, confidential informants, would get. And that's typically, they just get referred to as a CI number, and that's to preserve their confidentiality. Typically, again, the more complicated cases where if the informant's identity was known, they would probably have a challenging time, because the suspect might be willing to go do them harm. So a little bit more here on kind of the flow of what police reports look like. So you have your investigator, lots of different actions and activities that are going to happen, but ultimately the reports are going to get sent to a supervisor. The supervisor is going to review and approve that. Generally speaking, that will flow from the supervisor to the prosecutor's office for charging, and then once the prosecutor receives that, they can make that charging decision, and then the investigator is going to hold on to that case disposition for the retention period. So as a whole, police reports, again, they've got to be factual, accurate, as we discussed, complete, because you can't have a incomplete investigative file. That can be very problematic. If you get a defense request for discovery and there's different information provided to the defense than there is the prosecutor, you could compromise the entire case at that point. And then there's obviously the review process of police reports to, number one, make sure that they are complete and that they're accurate, but the spelling and grammar and that the report is professionally written are all parts of that review process. Again, generally done by a supervisor, or there's some agencies will require a peer review before it is presented to a supervisor or before it ever makes its way to the prosecutor's office. So a good way to ensure that the police reports and the case file is completed is to use checklists. And most agencies will adopt some sort of a checklist to ensure that the case is complete. This is an example from New York State Police, and it's multiple pages. As you can see, this is page 13 of 15 for a checklist. So obviously, a more serious type of a crime would have that many pages of checklists, but the reason again for such a checklist is to ensure that the case is truly complete, that there's accountability for each of the items listed on the list. Very useful for a supervisor review, not only reading the reports for content, but then to check the boxes to make sure that everything is present and accounted for. And then for consistency, so that every case is done the same way. If you have a checklist for every type of report, this makes the whole review process much easier. It also makes it easier for the officer or for the detective to know what the expectations are for a particular crime, what documents or proofs would be needed for the completed case file. So lastly, before we wrap it up on this presentation and you move into the module, just know what the assignment this week's going to look like. So we're going to put all of these skills to the test, and you're going to review a video and then create a detailed police report from the video of the incident. And what I put here is bringing order to chaos. As you can see, this scene, which there's many scenes that you may go to as a police officer that look just like this. And how do you determine what's valuable in a room full of, what appears to be just junk? It's very difficult. So you're going to bring some sort of order to a chaotic scenario. And so you'll see on the video that it's not too chaotic. It's actually a pretty sanitary scene that's presented, but do pay special close attention again when you write it to try to not make inferences, but instead make observations. List those observations out, be detailed, avoid any kind of jargon, write it in just common language so that it's easy to understand and it makes chronological sense. But do try to take it serious. You'll have some literary license to make names and dates and locations up. But if you have any questions with the assignment, contact me early so that we can get those corrected. Other than that, have a great week and we'll see you in the module.